Hey folks, I think we're finally live here. I apologize. I had some technical difficulties there, trying to figure out how to get this thing going here. So let me adjust that. Hopefully that works there. So again, my apologies for messing this thing up. I don't like being tardy, so it looks like I'm 11 minutes late here. So I had some problems getting this thing launched. It looks like I got it figured out. It's been a long time since I've done one of these things. I was hoping it would be in the landscape mode, or the portrait mode, but I guess it's not going to be in that. So let's just go ahead and get started with this. So again, I appreciate everybody hanging on, and apologize for not having the technical stuff worked out in advance there. So, any case, I wanted to talk very quickly. Well, let's say the next 20 minutes or so about some newer developments as far as the DB Cooper case is concerned, specifically as it pertains to the tie, and also DB Cooper, where DB Cooper came from, where he worked at some point in time. Now, I want to put a clarification out there. In the video that I posted, that was the minute-long video about a week ago, I said that I was 100% certain about where I knew DB Cooper came from. I want to be very clear about this because I think I misspoke. I overspoke on that. I believe I know with certainty, the area, the field, that type of thing. But I'm going to name a specific company today, and I'm going to name a specific spot. And it would be foolish to say with absolute 100% certainty that I know that the guy came from there. Any kind of grand pronouncements on that level in this case, I think, is pretty foolish. There's just too many moving parts and too many variables there. But I want to say that firstly, my approach to this has always been that you take the evidence that you have, and that you work with the evidence that you have, and you craft theories related to the case, whether it's people that you think may be DB Cooper, places he may have been, how he escaped, where he landed, whatever the case may happen to be. But prudence dictates, and I think intellectual honesty dictates, that as new information comes in, you modify those theories. Makes perfect sense, right? So in the case of where DB Cooper worked, as many of you know, for the last couple of years, I've been pretty adamant that he had to come from Remcrete titanium. He had to come from crucible steel because of this titanium and antimony alloy that was identified. I want to say that that has changed. And the reason it has changed is because the data, the input, the information that I'm working with, there's some additive information that has changed. And the additive information pertains to the tie, and specifically this effort that was launched, I want to say about 6, 7, 8 months ago, of a retesting of one of the stubs, stub 675. Now, stub 675 was one of the carbon sticky stubs that Tom K applied to the tie, specifically the tie knot, that served as really a treasure trove for particles and evidence and things of this nature. And he had decided, actually, a few of us had talked as a group about this before the testing began. And we thought, if there's one stub that we should retest, it should be 675. And I want to applaud the efforts of the DB Cooper Mystery Group on Facebook, because the funding to make that happen was actually raised on the Facebook group. And of course, Tom K is the one who spearheaded that effort. But there were a handful of others who obviously were part of that as well, in terms of spearheading, moving this forward, and so forth. Now, the new information that I've been primarily interested in is something that Tom talked about at the last DB Cooper conference just a couple months ago. And this relates to the uranium specifically, but also one other aspect of it as well. Now, I think that the particle that I'm going to talk about here is actually the single most important particle that has been discovered on the tie. Now there is a uranium particle that has been found on a uranium particle. I'll get that out properly. Uranium particle that has been found, and Tom did confirm that's uranium. Now the problem with that is, even though uranium is exceptionally rare, we don't know exactly what type of uranium that is. We know it's not part of an ore because it is a clean particle. There's nothing else with it. But we don't know, for example, if it's depleted uranium. Now, I don't want to get too technical here and all this stuff, but depleted uranium is essentially uranium that has been used up, basically. It's sort of the waste product. And it has been used in munitions, in ammunition, to replace lead and so forth, and bullets and that type of thing. So there is depleted uranium that's just kind of around on military shooting ranges and that kind of thing. So you can't be certain that that one single uranium particle wasn't depleted uranium, and perhaps it really isn't that special at all. However, there is one very, very special particle there, and that's a thorium and uranium particle. There's a thorium and a uranium particle that's very, very special there, because that's a different breed of cat. Having thorium and uranium together doesn't just happen accidentally, and this is not the kind of thing that you can just pick up anywhere, and it's also not the kind of thing that you can mistake easily. It's like what we're dealing with is actually thorium and uranium. Now, what's interesting about the thorium and uranium, as I started digging into it, is that thorium and uranium was essentially used or explored as a fuel for a very specific type of nuclear reactor that was experimented with in the 60s, called a molten salt reactor. And given that D.B. Cooper has a particle of what appears to be this thorium and uranium fuel, or a precursor to the fuel on the tie, I think is something that is critically important and helps really refine very closely where D.B. Cooper had to have picked up that particle on his tie. And again, I'm operating in a world where the tie wasn't purchased at Goodwill or some such place like that. And actually, the more we dig into the tie and the more that the exotic materials and particles and things come out, I'm more and more convinced of that. It just doesn't add up in my mind. So I'll cut straight to the chase here and say that after an enormous amount of looking into all kinds of things related to the thorium and uranium particle, plus a second thorium particle that includes aluminum, which is also critically important and also relates to this fuel process, I believe that D.B. Cooper likely, with a high degree of certainty, likely came from Union Carbide. Now, Union Carbide was a company that I remember being around. It's now part of Dow Chemicals, so it was absorbed into Dow Chemicals. But Union Carbide, importantly, ran, among other things, they ran the Oak Ridge National Laboratory just outside of Knoxville, Tennessee. And that's a critical place in part because it was at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, again, just outside of Knoxville, Tennessee, that between 1965 and 1969, they ran what was called a molten reactor experiment. And it was in that molten reactor experiment, starting in 1968, for about 1 year or a little over a year, from like March of 68 to the end of 69, that they were experimenting with this thorium and uranium fuel as part of the molten salt reactor. And it's very technical, and I'm not going to try to explain it, and I don't fully understand all the ins and outs myself. But the thing is that, fortunately for us, I believe this stuff is very, very limited, and ultimately the experiment was shut down in 1969, and there were significant layoffs that went along with that at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. But the thing hung in there. They continued to work on it without the reactor actually operating until 1973, and it was in 1973 when it was completely axed. Now, the reason that it was shut down, the experiment was shut down, and it appears to have been successful, actually very successful, is that there was a different type of nuclear reactor that was also being experimented with at the time. And ultimately, the federal government decided, the United States Department of Energy decided that they wanted to go with that other version versus the molten salt reactor. The net effect, as far as the project is concerned at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, which again was run and managed by Union Carbide, and everyone who worked there was an employee of Union Carbide, the net effect was that thing got iced, and there were a lot of people that lost their jobs in 1969. Now, why I think that's important, the losing the job thing, is that the more that I think about this, I think that D.B. Cooper, like, I mean, here was a guy who was about 50 years old, appears to have been well educated, and, doesn't appear in my mind to have been a career criminal. And something precipitated this guy deciding to do something as drastic as skyjacking a jet. This wasn't a crime of opportunity, kind of like you're walking down the street and you find a bag with 200 grand sitting in it, and you quickly look around, and then in a split second you decide to take the bag and just run. This was something that obviously involves some planning, some work, at a minimum several days worth of planning and work. So this, something in my mind had to have precipitated this event. And it makes sense that there was some sort of economic calamity that this D.B. Cooper experienced, whoever this guy was that D.B. Cooper experienced, that ultimately led him to feeling like, this is my ticket out. This is my way to get a couple hundred grand. Now, so I know that there were significant layoffs in 1969 around the shuttering of this operation. Now, I don't believe D.B. Cooper, based upon the tie particles and the totality of the tie particles, I don't believe that D.B. Cooper worked exclusively on that. Rather, I think he worked at Oak Ridge as a metallurgist, and he dealt with a number of different things. And they dealt with powdered titanium metals. They dealt with, stainless steels, aluminums, all the stuff that we have found on D.B. Cooper's tie, and actually all the stuff that we have seen that REM crew was involved in. Critically, however, REM crew had nothing to do with uranium, nuclear reactors, or anything of that nature. Now, let me talk very briefly about the titanium and antimony alloy, because on the surface, one would think, well, that's a problem. If this was something that was specific to REM crew, how the hell did he get that on his tie if he's working for Union Carbide in Knoxville, Tennessee? The thing is that if you look very carefully, the titanium and antimony alloy was worked on and researched and basically patented in the late 1950s. There was a single patent attributed to then Crucible Steel that was from 1965 that involved the titanium and antimony alloy that I'm talking about. However, it doesn't involve the alloy itself. It doesn't involve tinkering with the alloy in terms of the chemical balance or anything. Rather, it deals with the building of this high pressure chamber, like steam chamber, high pressure kind of chamber, that is made in part with this titanium and antimony alloy, which is intriguing because obviously when you're dealing with nuclear energy and that type of thing, this is the kind of thing that you would kind of expect to see around there. Now, I have looked really deeply at the thorium and uranium alloy, specifically into thorium and uranium work, and there were a number of labs that were part of the national laboratory system. There were a number of national labs around, and a handful of them tinkered with it. The problem is that most of that, virtually all of the research and stuff that was done on that was before the tie existed. So this is pre-tie. Most of it was in the late 1950s. And you see, I've come across some writings about this, research reports and so forth, from the very early 60s, 1960, 1961, that references some of the fine work that was done looking at this alloy. But again, that was pre-tie by a good many years. for our purposes, I think it's worth considering that the tie, in all likelihood, didn't find its way into D.B. Cooper's workplace until at the earliest, the beginning of 1965. So we have to find a way to explain him getting this stuff on the tie from 1965 on. And this is part of the reason that I'm so intrigued with Oak Ridge National Laboratory, is because it was after 1968 when they started exploring specifically the thorium and uranium. And the fuel that was used in that experiment was created there at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. It wasn't made somewhere else, then shipped to Oak Ridge. It was actually created there. So again, while I think D.B. Cooper was involved with it tangentially, meaning the molten salt reactor project, I do not believe that he was exclusively with that. Maybe he was for a period of time, but when you look at the totality of the other particles on the tie, powdered titanium metals and rare earth elements and stainless steel and things of that nature, that is all very consistent with the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. But the titanium, for example, was not used. Titanium was not used as part of this molten salt reactor experiment. So that's why I believe we've got something there. Now I've pondered, okay, let's say D.B. Cooper got 86. Maybe he lost his job in 1969. You know, that's still a couple of years before the skyjacking took place in 1971. I've considered, well, you know, what does he do? What does that mean? And there's actually a handful of things that could have happened. He could have remained effectively unemployed at that point, and finally, after a couple of years, you know, he decided to pull this thing off. Maybe he was underemployed, making half of what he was making somewhere else. Or perhaps, just perhaps, he was transferred within the company and placed at one of the other metals divisions in the company. One of which, by the way, there were 6, one of which was located in Portland, Oregon, by the way. But the one that I'm primarily interested in is one in Marietta, Ohio, because the metals facility in Marietta, Ohio, worked on a lot of the same stuff that the Oak Ridge laboratory worked on, related to the powdered metals and titanium and all that kind of stuff. And interestingly, if you look at the history of that particular lab, the Marietta, Ohio Union Carbide Metals Lab, they had a big kerfuffle with the federal government. The federal government really came down on them with their pollution and was mandating that they cut their pollutants. And ultimately what ended up happening is Union Carbide had a big layoff. They laid off more than half of their employees at that plant in 1971. They laid them off in 1971, and there was a big legal mess related to that, because a lot of the employees felt like the company didn't actually need to lay off the people. They were just playing hardball with the government, with Congress and everything. And I should mention that and I think I did mention that when the molten salt reactor experiment was ultimately discontinued in 1973, but more importantly shut down in 1969, this was a direct result of a significant cut in funding from the federal government of 2/3. They slashed the funding 2/3 in 1969, which ultimately led to this. So you can envision a situation, I'm just throwing this out there as a possibility, that D.B. Cooper, perhaps D.B. Cooper, worked at Oak Ridge National Laboratory, had been there for many years, was a successful person, and then ultimately fell victim in 1969 to the layoffs, which were significant there again at Oak Ridge in Knoxville, Tennessee. And because of the politicians, the funding was slashed. You can see a situation where D.B. Cooper gets transferred to the Union Carbide plant, which is similar in many respects, the metal division up the road in Ohio. And 2 years later, the same exact thing happens again. The politicians come down, they cut the funding, they put pressure on them, and bingo, he's out of work again. So I'm just throwing it out there as a possibility that D.B. Cooper was a guy who within 2 short years got laid off twice. And, 1971, if the guy's around 50 years old, we know that it was an economically depressed time as far as the aerospace and the metals sector was concerned. His prospects would have been very, very dim, and that may have precipitated his ultimately skyjacking the jet again, November of 1971. Now that's just a theory as far as that goes, but I think it all makes sense there. And I don't want to. I'm not going to get too much into the technical stuff here. I mean, people can dig in and try and look at this themselves, but I feel very, very comfortable that's the case. One of the very interesting things that's worth noting as well relates to that book of matches that D.B. Cooper had on the jet, that he was observed on the jet, the Sky Chef's matches. There are many pictures of the Blue Sky Chef's matches that were similar to what D.B. Cooper was seen having on the jet. And on the back side it lists 16 Sky Chef's restaurants around the country at that time in 1971. Well, the sixth one down was at an airport called McGee-Tyson Airport, which just so happens to be the airport for Knoxville, Tennessee. So that's another very intriguing thing to consider, that perhaps D.B. Cooper stayed around that area and flew out of that airport, because that's the airport he would have flown out of, one of the few airports, only 16 locations nationwide for the Sky Chefs. Perhaps that's where he actually picked up the Sky Chef's matchbook cover from. A very intriguing thing to consider. And one last thing I'll mention here, and this is a little vortexy as well, and actually Chris Brower brought it to my attention, because I have confided in Chris Brower about this in advance. He was the only person I had confided in about this. And Chris mentioned that the person who headed up the Oak Ridge National Laboratory was a guy named Alvin Weinberg. Is Alvin Weinberg? I think it's Alvin Weinberg. And he noted that the author of the D.B. Cooper comic was Albert Weinberg. I believe the last name's Weinberg. It's either Weinberg or Weinstein, but Weinberg. But remarkably similar, Alvin Weinberg and Albert Weinberg. So it's one of those vortexy kind of things, because ultimately the guy who was the person who ran Oak Ridge and ran the molten salt reactor and was responsible for obviously determining who got laid off and who didn't get laid off there for Union Carbide. Maybe there was some bad blood there. I don't know. It sounded kind of an interesting thing to consider there. So I'm thinking, I don't have any notes written because I don't like having notes written. I like just kind of going off the cuff and going from memory here. So I feel like I'm forgetting something else here. But either way, the larger point is that I think that the really critical evidence here, and again, I would say it's the most valuable particle discovered on this tie, and it was just recently discovered, was this thorium and uranium particle. And that clearly points to nuclear fuel for the molten salt reactor, and also the second particle of thorium that has aluminum with it, that also clearly points to nuclear fuel for a molten salt reactor specifically. And again, molten salt reactors, there was a very small window of actually research that was done on this thing, and it was operated between 1965 and 1969, which perfectly overlaps that tie from 1965 onward. So that would make sense as far as that goes, as far as that stuffing ending up on the tie. And when you consider Union Carbide's run-ins with the government with some of these things, the loss of funding that affected that place specifically, Oak Ridge specifically, and then of course Marietta, Ohio plant in 1971 specifically, that's definitely intriguing as well, because it does seem unlikely. It does seem unlikely to me that this was some guy just, not a career criminal, happy guy, 50 years of age, pretty content with life, and just snapping and deciding, I'm going to skyjack a jet and risk my life, or 45 years in prison, or whatever the case may happen to be, which in effect was a death sentence at that point. And it was a capital crime, as a matter of fact, because of the Hobbs Act. So it seems to me that something had to precipitate that there. So what does all of this mean? I'm going to touch very briefly on Vince Peterson. What does all this mean for Vince Peterson? What this means as far as Vince Peterson is concerned, who has been my primary person of interest for a couple of years now, is he simply cannot explain the uranium particle. And if he can't explain the uranium particle and the thorium particles, and there was a few, if he can't explain that, then there is no way that he could have been D.B. Cooper, barring some really bizarre situation where the real D.B. Cooper came into contact with Vince Peterson at Rem Crew Titanium, or some such thing. But it doesn't. There wasn't any kind of relationship there between those two companies that would explain that. And I did actually remember something here. I'm glad that I talked a little bit longer here. It's worth noting that immediately preceding the molten salt reactor experiment, which started in 1965, in the immediate few years preceding that, I want to say from like around 1960 up until about that time, there was another, in that exact same building, there was another nuclear project that was being explored that, again, D.B. Cooper may have been a part of if he was actually there working as a metallurgist. And that relates to this research that they were doing, trying to create a nuclear-powered aircraft. The federal government was interested specifically in a bomber that would be nuclear-powered, that could fly great distances and all this type of stuff. And this was something that was explored right there in the same exact building, using nuclear fuels and that kind of stuff, that were kind of a precursor to the stuff that was later tried in the molten salt reactor experiment. But that ended up being shuttered as well, because they just couldn't manage it. Technologically, it just was too much of an issue. Boeing was involved with that project. Boeing was involved with that project, that nuclear power project. This would have been the very early 1960s, late 50s, early 1960s. So again, if you're D.B. Cooper and you work there, you're working there, you're a metallurgist working on a variety of things, and there's no reason to think that he hadn't been there for several years. Again, as a Union Carbide employee, that may explain his exposure and relationship to Boeing. And then ultimately, after that thing was shuttered and the molten salt reactor experiment came about, may explain the few particles of the thorium and uranium that ended up showing up on his tie. And when you consider the chef's matches, matches with the McGee-Tyson Airport location is one of the very few locations where there was a Sky Chef restaurant and everything else. Becomes all very intriguing. Again, when you compound that with the layoffs and things that took place first in '69 and then in 1971, that seemed to be largely confined to Union Carbide among the national laboratories. That's an intriguing thing. I looked at, for example, the Ames National Laboratory, which is in Iowa and works with the University of Iowa. There's no record of any kind of layoffs there from like the 1971 that time frame there. They seem to sort of dodge the bullet as far as that goes. And the reason why is because the federal government really had it out for the nuclear stuff during that time, though, in early 1970s, for those of you who are old enough to remember that, and 3 Mile Island is some of the stuff that came after that. So there we go. That's it. That's my take on it. I officially have no person of interest regarding who D.B. Cooper actually was. Obviously, I'm looking into it, but you're dealing with a lot of people, a lot of men, and you've got a pretty big company and movements of people and that kind of thing. But I feel very, very, very confident that D.B. Cooper was part of that national laboratory activity in the 1960s, perhaps all the way in the 1971, and specifically Union Carbide, because Union Carbide, of course, dealt with managing the Oak Ridge National Laboratory in Knoxville, Tennessee. Some of the other labs were managed by other companies, Phillips 66, University of Iowa, that type of thing. So different thing. So there you go. That's the big news there, and I think that all of this came from this recent retesting of Stub 675 that shined a light specifically on the uranium and the thorium that we were unaware of before. And those, again, uranium and thorium is a lot different than titanium and antimony, or some particular alloy of steel or what have you. We're in a different league here. This is definitely not the kind of stuff you just randomly pick up somewhere. We're talking uranium and thorium, not at all. So that is a very big tell, pointing to where this guy was at some point in time between, let's say, 1965 and 1971. And I think it's pretty clear that he had some sort of involvement with that molten salt reactor experiment through Oak Ridge National Laboratory, probably primarily between the 65 to 1969 time frame. But D.B. Cooper may have worked there for 2 decades before. I mean, he may have been there for the previous 15 years, and then, the shit hit the fan in 69 or whatever the case may happen to be. So there you go. That's it. Union Carbide, thorium, uranium, that's the real deal. We can explain the titanium and antimony that Rem Crew was working with, because we're dealing with a high-pressure chamber type of thing, which, of course, this stuff worked with. And there you go. So have fun digging into that and looking into people, if you're interested, as I am, who worked at Union Carbide, and specifically in Knoxville, Tennessee. And we'll go with that. So that's it. That's it, folks. I know there's a lot of people scrolling and commenting. I'm afraid I can't read any of that stuff, because I'm not wearing my readers here or anything, and plus I'm trying to just think about what I'm trying to say here. So, in any case, I appreciate everybody listening to this, and again, I apologize profusely for making everybody wait, 11, 12 minutes, whatever, before this thing finally got underway. I'm totally responsible. I should have done a dry run in advance, and I didn't, and was stuck trying to figure out how to make it happen, and quickly reached out to Nikki, and Nikki and I were talking on the phone trying to figure it out, and finally we managed to put it together. So I do want to say in closing one final thing here, that I know Tom K has expressed interest in doing another retesting of some of the other stubs, one or more of the other stubs. Obviously doing anything like that costs money. Tom was the one who spearheaded the last effort. He's got a terrific relationship with McCrone, who was basically willing to test the stuff essentially at cost. So I do want to say that as far as this first one went, the retesting, I consider it a huge breakthrough and very, very successful. And I'll leave it up to Tom to decide how he wants to proceed as far as the retesting of some additional stubs or what have you. But hopefully, the D.B. Cooper Mystery Group, again, on Facebook, and anybody who's watching this that's not a member, feel free to join the D.B. Cooper Mystery Group. Hopefully, we'll see the same sort of activity on the part of its members in helping raise the funds, what amounted to a couple $1,000s, as I recall, to actually retest the stub, have McCrone retest the stub, and come up with the information that we came up with, the data that we're working with today. So there you go, folks. That's it. I want to say again, thank you very much, and cheerio. Any questions, feel free to just post them there or shoot me an email, eric@ericulis.com, and I'll do my best to answer them. All right, folks, thanks. Cheers.